Sarcoma Stories is a podcast created by Sarcoma Foundation of America to highlight the voices and experiences of patients, survivors, and care partners. After listening, be sure to join our Sarcoma Stories podcast Facebook group to connect with the community and discuss the episode. Follow us and enable notifications on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss new episodes. You can also find all episodes and information on this subtype or your subtype on SFA's website, curesarcoma.org. Links are in this episode's description. This week, we speak with Sarah Downey, an angiosarcoma patient, advocate, and writer. Sarah takes us through her diagnosis journey, which included misdiagnosis and dismissal of symptoms, all while navigating her senior year of college. Since her diagnosis, she has navigated treatment as she's entered young adulthood and shares with us what it's been like coping with the uncertainty of sarcoma alongside this major life transition. A lifelong writer, Sarah recently began the project Echoes of Us RI to highlight stories of fellow patients, medical professionals, and caretakers, contributing to narrative medicine as a form of advocacy. Sarah explains how this has played a role in her journey and also given her both an outlet and a purpose. When she isn't writing or at treatment, Sarah travels as much as she can and gives some tips on how she makes this work between treatments. She also talks about how she chooses to live despite her prognosis. This episode will both educate and inspire, true to Sarah as a writer and a human. Let's dive in. Welcome back to Sarcoma Stories, and welcome if this is your first time listening. I'm Tasha. I'm one of your hosts.
Hey, and I'm Katie, your other host.
And today we have Sarah Downey joining us. Sarah is a 23-year-old with a diagnosis of cardiac angiosarcoma, and she's here to share her story today. So, Sarah, before we dive into your sarcoma story, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone. As Tasha said, my name is Sarah Downey. I am a writer, a traveler, a young adult cancer advocate, and I am from Tiverton, Rhode Island. I went to Providence College and graduated from there in 2024, where I studied Spanish, secondary education, and women and gender studies. And I was diagnosed with cardiac angiosarcoma the second semester of my senior year of college. And since then, I have been very passionate about advocacy, specifically for young adult sarcoma patients. And I've recently created a website called Echoes of Us, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But it's a young adult cancer advocacy platform, and I'm the main writer and co-founder of the site.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk about Echoes of Us. And I feel like this is very full circle because you and I first met at an adolescent young adult conference
Yes.
where you were just starting this in the beginning of your diagnosis. And it feels very full circle for you to have launched that and be sharing your story through storytelling, which is really what you focus on today. Sarah, you mentioned you were diagnosed your second semester of senior year in college, which must be a very interesting time to be diagnosed with a sarcoma. So, do you want to share a little bit of how that process went for you?
Yeah, I was diagnosed in February of 2024, so just at the beginning of my second semester of my senior year of college. I had been searching for answers to symptoms since the fall of the previous year. I had started with chest pain and a cough from a virus that just didn't go away. I believe I had COVID in the summer. And my primary care doctor dismissed my symptoms and as anxiety and prescribed me an anxiety medication to take when these symptoms really came about, because they did primarily come about at night, which I later learned was because I was laying down and the blood vessels where the tumor was were being compressed more when I laid down. But after having my symptoms written off, I tried to search for other reasons for my symptoms. So I thought that possibly it could be my wisdom teeth because I knew they were impacted. So I went to an oral surgeon and started the process of hopefully getting them removed. I never actually made it to get them removed because after getting another virus coming back from a trip from Spain following the holidays, I started to have worsening symptoms. The cough came back, the chest pain got a lot worse to a point where it was really unbearable, and I started to have fevers that got up into the 103s, 104s, and I didn't really have a doctor that I felt comfortable going to, so I felt like I hit a dead end, but I was able to see, and I had to advocate for this, but I pushed to see a female nurse practitioner at my PCP's office, and I had never met her before, but she listened to me. She took me seriously. She ordered pretty much every blood panel possible, and after not finding answers, she ordered more tests and continued to push further. And that was when I finally went to get a chest x-ray at a local ER. And all they were able to see in the chest x-ray at the time was some kind of shadows and fluid around my heart. So they ordered further testing, which revealed a 15 centimeter mass around my heart, around my aorta, around a lot of the vessels. It was primarily on the right side of my heart. From there, I was transferred 2 more times. First to a hospital that misdiagnosed me with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and because of the poor care I received at this hospital, I was transferred to another hospital where I was able to receive a surgical biopsy, and at the time I was in critical care, but I finally received a diagnosis after about a week and a half of all of that chaos with being transferred. And when I received this diagnosis, I actually started treatment the same morning because they told me it was so important that I started right away, which left me very little room to do things such as freezing my eggs or even looking into those kind of options. And I also wasn't really given an opportunity to have a say in what kind of treatment I received. It was more just take the most aggressive route and hope for the best. And after a month of being in the hospital, I felt like I wasn't completely comfortable with where I was receiving my treatment, at least where I was inpatient. So then I decided to make another pivot.
Once you received the diagnosis, were you at a sarcoma center then?
I didn't receive my diagnosis at a sarcoma center. I received my diagnosis just at a hospital when I was inpatient. And they did talk to other doctors who were part of sarcoma centers to get to the treatment that I was on. But they were less confident in being able to treat me. And that's why I sought out a sarcoma center because I didn't feel comfortable being somewhere that wasn't specialized in sarcoma when I knew that there were sarcoma centers in my area. I feel very lucky to be in an area where there's not only one sarcoma center, but multiple, because I know that a lot of people do not have that opportunity. So when I'm stuck in traffic and it takes me 2 hours to get to treatment, I don't feel so bad. I mean, I feel lucky that it's only 2 hours.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, how did you know that you should seek out a sarcoma center? What led you to that decision?
So there are two parts to why I wanted to seek out a different oncologist, and the first had really nothing to do with the quality of my actual medical care. It had more to do with wanting to be with an oncologist that saw me as a whole person, which is something that I talk a lot about on my website. I talk a lot about when I give conferences and different events at local organizations. And it's a big facet of narrative medicine, which is what my my advocacy is based around. So from the start, before I even knew what narrative medicine was, I just as a person wanted to feel heard. And I felt that if cancer was going to pretty much become my life at the moment, I wanted that doctor to know who I was beyond cancer. And I felt like the doctor I first started out with only saw me as a number. And I also felt that this is the kind of leading to the second part is that he did not seem confident in being able to treat me effectively. I had asked him, "So, what's your experience with this type of cancer?" And he said, "Well, I've treated some sarcomas," because his specialty wasn't sarcoma, but he had treated some sarcomas. And I thought to myself, well, if he's treated some sarcomas, and my sarcoma is one of the rarest types of sarcoma, then this isn't looking good. Like, I don't feel comfortable with this care. And so I actually had a very prominent person in oncology come and talk to me off the record and tell me, hey, I didn't tell you this, but I would go to a sarcoma center because you aren't going to get the care that you need here. And with where you're at the time, I was given months to live, if that. I mean, before I had gone into the hospital, I was probably weeks away from possibly passing away. And so, knowing my prognosis, this doctor told me, I want you to have the best shot, and that's going to be at a sarcoma center. And so, I was very lucky to have someone who was completely honest with me, even if that meant not necessarily giving her institution my business, which also showed me that she was someone who cared more about the patient as a whole than as a statistic or a number.
That's powerful. And I think an important piece of sarcoma care that I know we've had conversations about. We want the community oncologists to be educated on sarcoma because, of course, not everybody can get to a sarcoma center. And we want them to know how to treat, but also know when to refer out.
I noticed that a few times during my diagnosis because at the first hospital I was at the emergency room, the doctor told me once they saw the mass and its size, they said, "We're not capable of even doing a biopsy here, and we don't want to put you in danger." So they transferred me. And at the second hospital, that's where I had the issue. And the reason why I transferred out of the second hospital was because they were too confident. And they told me, "Oh, we'll do the biopsy, but you're probably going to end up in critical care." And when I decided to make another switch, I felt comfortable in my decision because at that next hospital, they told me, yes, there are a lot of risks to putting you under anesthesia right now because of how critical you are. But we have the tools and resources to put you under anesthesia and have a team monitoring you throughout the entire process, throughout the entire procedure. And so that honesty and that ability to say, we're able to help you up until this point has been really important in my story. And if it weren't for that honesty, I don't think I would be here.
That's really amazing how you have advocated for yourself and how you've found people that have supported you in that too on your care team.
Yeah, and I think self advocacy is such an important part of my story and many people's stories because even though I did have people who were supportive, which changes everything, It took, especially at the beginning of my diagnosis with getting in to see that nurse practitioner, it took phone calls upon phone calls and raising my voice and saying, "No, I need to be seen today." Like, there was no time to wait, and I knew that it was getting to a point where I needed to get in right away, and there was no sense of urgency within the system, within the hospitals, I mean, until I got to the later stages and the later hospitals. But at first, there was really no sense of urgency outside of myself because I was the only one who knew that something was going on and it was getting bad fast. Whereas everyone else around me was kind of like, it can wait. You're okay. We have an MRI scheduled for a month from now. And so within the system, it takes self advocacy, I think, no matter where you are.
How would you describe the act of self advocacy if you were to say to somebody else who feels that urgency within themselves, right? Because I think what you're describing is like you live in your body, you knew something was wrong, and everybody around you can't feel that, but you knew you had to ask and speak up. How would you describe the actual act of it?
Well, I think it can be very frustrating because when you are put in a position where you have to advocate for yourself, it often means that the people around you aren't necessarily helping you in the way that you need help. But I also think that self advocacy is a tool and something that we need in our lives no matter how much support we have. And I think that something that people need to understand is that when you advocate for yourself, you are not being bossy, you are not being rude, you are putting yourself first in a system that doesn't see you fully. Obviously, doctors do care about their patients, many do, but you are living in your body, and doctors and the healthcare system in general are not going to be affected by your health in the way that you're going to be affected by your health. And there's that phrase, you don't have anything unless you have your health. You don't realize how important it is until you you lack good health.
Right.
And I think that if you think that something is wrong inside of you and you don't feel like you're being taken seriously, not only do you have the right, but you owe it to yourself to speak up, even if speaking up feels uncomfortable or feels unnatural. Because I think it is going to feel unnatural because we are not taught to speak up, especially as women and especially to people who have roles that are seen as more powerful or positions of power. We're not conditioned to speak up for ourselves and raise our voices in those cases.
Totally. You found a team who you do feel supported by now.
Something I always say is that I feel so grateful to have found a team that supports me and understands me and knows me for a whole person, especially after going through what I went through with my diagnosis, because my diagnosis was just chaos and frustration. And now, when I go in for treatment and I go in for appointments, everything seems to just flow from the moment I walk in to the moment I leave. And even people at the front desk know who I am. And so I genuinely look forward to going in for appointments and treatment. because I have made so many connections with my providers.
Once you were diagnosed, what were the next steps from there? Because my understanding was that you started treatment somewhere, but then you moved to a different team.
Okay.
And what was your did you continue the treatments that you were initially doing, or what happened from there?
So I began treatment immediately in the hospital. I did 2 rounds of treatment in the hospital, and then was lucky enough to get into my current oncologist's office for a general appointment that same week, the same week that I left the inpatient hospital. And I immediately told him after meeting him, "Yep, I want to transfer." He told me, "I can be someone who you talk to and look to for support, even if I'm not your oncologist, if you don't want to go through the process of transferring." And I looked him in the eyes and I said, "No, I'm leaving. I know that this is where I am meant to be." And I just felt an instant connection with him and with the team. And because he had actually already been consulting with that group of doctors on my case, he advised me to continue the same treatment. And so I was on a treatment that involved 2 drugs that was overall a very aggressive treatment. I lost my hair, I had nausea, everything was swollen. I had pretty much all of the typical chemotherapy side effects, exhaustion, but I was also still in college. So I didn't have to take classes because I had already finished my classes to be able to graduate. But I was still living close to campus in a college house with friends, and I was still trying to attend events and be a part of the end of my senior year. And it was definitely an interesting balance between going to treatment and then coming home to a house full of college kids and attending college parties and events. And I think that ultimately, I don't know what it was. I think it might have been the steroids that got me through, but I had so much energy for the first 6 months of treatment. And like I said, I think it was steroids, but I genuinely felt like I had superpowers for some reason. And I was on this treatment for 6 months. And then I had a 2 week break. I went to Spain immediately for my break, which I still tend to do for almost all of my breaks. And then I started proton beam radiation in end of summer, and I did that for 8 weeks. And following that, I was able to have a little bit of a break, about 2.5 months, to see if that treatment had worked. However, I started to develop pain in my back. And so while my cardiac tumor was stable, in about January or February of the following year of 2025, I found out that my cancer had spread to my hips and my lower back. And there was a tiny spot on my initial PET scan that showed it could have been in one of my hips, but at the time, the cardiac tumor was way more serious and we had to deal with that. So we kind of ignored that little spot and thought it could be just an artifact. But we later found out that it did turn into something. So I restarted chemo in February of 2025. And since then, I've remained on treatment and I've just been switching medications at various points. And I'll continue to do so indefinitely. It was definitely odd and also difficult to restart treatment at the same time that I had started treatment the year before.
Yeah. I
I
was gonna say that's pretty much the anniversary of your diagnosis.
I was able to celebrate my anniversary without really before I found out that my cancer had spread, and so That was my first year celebrating. It was super fun. I made everyone wear colorful wigs. We went out to eat. We went to a karaoke bar. And ever since then, I guess it's only been 2 years, but I've made the anniversary something fun.
I was going to ask you to talk about that because you said celebrate my anniversary. And I think someone listening to this might think, well, are you done? What are you celebrating? So could you talk a little bit about that because you're not done with treatments. You said you'll be on them indefinitely.
A few months into my treatment, I had a conversation with my oncologist about prognosis, which it's kind of a conversation that I think a lot of people want to have, but it also sometimes can feel useless because there's no number you can really put on cancer and where things are going to go because it's just so unpredictable. But when I had this initial conversation, I was told that the longest my oncologist had seen a patient live with this type of cancer had been 1 year. And so I prepared myself that things were going to get worse fast. And things got better. And so when that 1 year came about, I wasn't necessarily celebrating that things got better. I was just celebrating that I was alive. And I think that was something that I got really good at doing over the first year of my diagnosis and my treatment was celebrating, even if it was something really small, which obviously being alive and that 1 year mark is not small, it's very big, but I mean just like the very small things. I celebrate my birthday has always been something I've celebrated very big, but that also came out of something traumatic. I lost my father the day before my 17th birthday, and the year following that year, I made my birthday something to celebrate and not just like a little cake and go out to dinner, but like the whole weekend, every day was something going very big. And so I think that I've always had this mindset of instead of focusing on the challenging part, for example, for my birthday, having that anniversary of my father's passing and focusing on that and focusing on the grief surrounding my birthday, I tried to just amplify the celebration. And so I feel like that's a similar concept to what I did when I got my diagnosis and I started having to go through these moments, like my birthday, for example, with the knowledge of my mortality and the possibility that this could be my last of everything. And so, just instead of focusing a lot on those days where you're kind of expected to be happy, I focused on every day being a celebration of living. And so when I got to that anniversary, on one hand, it was just another day of being alive. But then on the other hand, it was a reminder of what my doctor had said at the beginning when he said, I haven't seen anyone live much past a year. And it was a celebration of making it that far and feeling good and knowing that I had done everything I could to live my best life in that year. And I recognized on that first anniversary that it could be my last and that the following year I could possibly not be there. But I think for me, it's important to be able to recognize that possibility and still be able to celebrate. I'm not really necessarily scared of death or dying, but I know a lot of people are. So I don't want to say that you shouldn't be scared of it, But I think that for me, I felt that when I was able to let go of that fear of dying or missing out or things being my last, I felt like I could do pretty much anything because I feel like that's what one of the most scary things when you talk about things that are scary. I mean, I think most people think of dying. And so I told myself that if I was able to get over that fear that I could pretty much do anything. And so second anniversary and I was again celebrating living. And I have to say my second anniversary was a lot different than my first.
Mm. It's almost like you took back control of a
Mhm.
situation that you don't really have a lot of control over. And when you get a prognosis that is like, okay, the longest we've seen is 1 year, w- there's that question of, well, what do you do with that time? And there's a lot of power in taking that time and saying, this is how I'm going to spend it. I think that's
Mm.
remarkable that you've chosen this for 2 years while also leaving room, I think, for the realities of it. I think this is something that has always struck me when we speak is that you're not shy either about the possibilities and also the hard stuff about going through treatment. You're quite honest about the mental health side of it.
When I made the decision to take that control, it was actually after reading a book called When Breath Becomes Air, which I feel like is a very popular book. But I felt after reading that book, I was up all night thinking about how I was going to make my life have the same kind of meaning that this patient and doctor made it, like how he made his life have meaning in that short time. And at first, I was compelled to try to make a list of things I could do that almost were equal to what he was, because he was a doctor, he was a surgeon, he had a family, he had a partner, and I started to compare my life to his, and I felt intimidated by the fact that I didn't have a lucrative and very prestigious career. I didn't have my own family or a partner to take care of. And I finally realized that I was able to take what I had at the moment, which a lot of it involves work I was doing in the community. I worked with kids at the time, an after school program, and it meant taking what I had, my friends, my work, and amplifying that and making that what I focused on. And so that was another thing I celebrate or continue to celebrate with every anniversary and just every milestone.
In what ways did year two feel different?
When year two came around, the biggest difference for me was that at this point, my cancer had spread and it had almost been like an anniversary of the cancer spreading at this point. And I had had a really hard year. The first year of treatment was almost like a walk in the park compared to the second. The second year for me felt very isolating. I felt a lot weaker. I went through a lot of challenges socially with people not understanding, and then just some challenges that had nothing to do with my cancer. But something that I think we also forget is that just because we have cancer doesn't mean that our other challenges stop. The other challenges we're going through in life don't just stop because we have cancer now. So year two for me was marked by a lot of those other challenges, whether it had to be with social challenges, things going on within my family, a lot of challenges with misunderstanding that I had in year one, but for some reason felt different in year two. And it sounds so morbid, but I think that year 1, I felt like I had this almost like this expiration date and I had to do everything, and I was just so focused on living my best life and having fun. And then year 2, I suddenly felt so much pain. I have chronic pain now from the mets in my back. And so the first year I experienced the chemo helping me and the treatment working. In year 2, it was a constant challenge of this treatment's not working, this treatment's making me sick, constantly changing and pivoting and having to cancel trips. So a lot of building up expectations and then feeling let down. And that was why celebrating year 2 was bittersweet because it was looking back on the year and thinking about how hard it was and how I was disappointed in many ways with how I chose to live the second year because I became very depressed and I isolated a lot and I didn't take advantage of the time in the way I would have liked to. And so that's like the bitter part of it, but then the sweet part of it was, of course, celebrating another year and realizing that I was still alive and that I could still make changes and go forward living how I wanted to live and living more intentionally. And I had a very bad bout of depression that lasted through January and was at its worst around the new year. And my anniversary is February 1st, and that period of depression started to improve right around my anniversary, and I really think it had nothing to do with my anniversary, but I just felt like my anniversary, instead of marking being here another year, it almost marked, like, I'm here right now, and I can go forward and take back that control that I had in year 1 and take back that feeling of doing the things that I wanna be doing rather than letting, and sometimes it's very hard, but letting the pain, physical and emotional pain of my cancer overtake me and cause me to isolate and cause me to step away from the things that bring me joy.
I think that's really open and honest and powerful for you to share that. That's a big part of a whole myriad of challenges and mental, physical obstacles that a AYA cancer patient faces as well. I can't imagine you said you think the steroids got you through the end of college, but feeling like you're probably, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but missing out on opportunities or experiences or grieving, why has this happened to me? Or I'm supposed to be finding exactly what my purpose and mission is, and it's being altered. So I'd love to hear from you the challenges you've experienced being an AYA patient, and then also what supports you have found to help you through that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of my biggest challenges, which I believe was amplified by the cancer, but it's something that most individuals face after graduating college, is feeling very isolated and distant from college friends and the college experience of living with your friends and seeing them every day and being part of a community. I felt like my college community was very close knit, and I suddenly felt like I wasn't going to be able to see them every day. And during my first 6 months of treatment, all I knew was constant daily support from my friends because I was living with them. And so when we graduated and I suddenly was faced with being alone, and so once I had my own apartment and was going through treatment while living on my own and being more distant with college friends, not because we didn't want to be together, but because just the circumstances changed. That caused me isolation. And then with the cancer, I felt like I couldn't relate to where my friends were going or where they were at following college because my friends were beginning careers. And in a lot of ways, I feel like I am constantly feeling like things could end at any moment and that things could be my last and that so it's a very different experience, and in a way I feel like I was winding down because the pain and my symptoms and my treatment made me take a step back, whereas my friends were getting started with full-time jobs, careers, and being in long-term stable relationships, people getting proposed to, engaged, even some friends having like babies. And so just a lot of things that I felt like not only was I not experiencing, but I felt like I might never get to experience. And so like you said, Katie, that feeling of grief was what marked that second year for me. And what really helped me with all of this, first and foremost, has been my team at my hospital, especially my social worker. She has given me a lot of resources to seek out other young adult cancer patients, talking to them. And this was actually before I started my website and started my own connecting. But this really all began with the young adult cancer program at my hospital. I started being more involved in events with them, volunteering at a lot of hospital charity events and doing speeches. And I've never been a big public speaker, but I love writing. And writing, I always said from day one, my dream job was always a writer. That was the first job I ever wanted. And after came a whole myriad of jobs, being a doctor, being a teacher. But my first and the one that most stuck with me was being a writer. And so I think I have found writing to be what has given me purpose in this experience, because I look back and I think, wow, like when I was 6 years old, I'd said I was going to be a writer, and that's something that I'm actually doing. And so it was one thing where I feel like I've actually accomplished, and it's an ongoing process. And that's the thing that I love too about the work that I'm doing now, is that it doesn't feel like there's an end date. It feels like it's something that's ongoing and that can even exist beyond me. And so that's been very special.
As you were speaking, I was like, you have found connection and support in the community of the adolescent young adult cancer space. And you have also found writing to be supportive and therapeutic. And so to take those two things and this talent that you have to put thoughts and experiences into words that have impact, and then take a community that you found support in and combine those two things is extremely purposeful. So can you share a little bit about Echoes of Us and what you have tried to do with it? And how it's ongoing. I like that you said that too. It feels like a living, breathing thing. It doesn't feel like just something you published and it's just there. It feels like it's alive and moving with you through life.
Yeah, so Echoes of Us came about after my cancer had spread, and I wanted to find a way to have purpose from my hospital bed or my couch or wherever I was, because at the time I wasn't able to go and be present in the events I was doing previously, the work I was doing that involved a lot more movement. So I began this project with a friend of mine who works with media and design. And it was going to be an exhibition that had an end date. So it was going to be something where we collected patient stories, talked to practitioners, and collected their stories, and then put these stories on display at an event. And we had said June of last year was our deadline. And then my cancer and my treatment put me in the hospital about 3 or 4 times at the beginning of last year, and I was unable to work on the website. And I had a few moments where I just didn't want to even think about it because I was just so upset with where my cancer was going. And so June almost pretty much came around and we hadn't even started the project. And then that summer, we came up with the idea of the website. And by the end of summer, I believe we had launched the beginnings of it. And so echoesofusri.com is a platform where we share patient stories, and we are currently working on gathering stories from healthcare providers and caregivers. And I do the interviews and then I write up the pieces, and sometimes I publish them in a more interview style. Oh, and other times I take the time to write more of an article of the person. And I always try to capture their voice and, of course, let them read through it before I publish it and have them share images because I just want it to feel like something that they can also be proud of because it's their story. And I'm just trying to communicate it to everyone else. So in those stories, I'm just there to be the bridge to get it to other people. And then I also have a section on the website called Reflections where I share stories of my own and my own writing about my cancer experience, about my experience with just so many different topics within the experience of cancer, from my feeling different in my body and my identity and my relationships with others. I share my diagnosis story. I share my experience with depression. A lot of the stories reflect my passion for literature and narrative medicine, which narrative medicine is a term and a teaching practice for doctors and for other healthcare workers that focuses on learning a patient's story and reading the patient's story, almost treating it like it were a book, and seeing that a patient's story has characters and has a full plot that's not just cancer. And I actually got in contact with the founder of narrative medicine, and I'm planning on doing some work with her in the future, which will be very exciting and feel full circle. But yeah, I think that while sometimes I feel like the website is not where I want it to be quite yet, I also understand that it is moving and breathing and living with me. And oftentimes it is so representative of where I am in my life, because when I'm not posting, it's usually because I there's something going on, and I feel like it represents my journey very well, and I hope that it is representing others in the way that they can feel good about.
I remember meeting you, and this was an idea at the time. So it's been incredible to see it come to life and take shape in a way that I agree. I think your journey is very intertwined with the birth of Echoes of Us, but also at the same time, you represent so many voices in it. So it's been really cool to see that take shape. And I was going to ask you what's the importance of storytelling? Advocacy is something that is so important to you and your journey, be it self advocacy or advocating for the community as a whole. And that's been an important part of your story. What is the importance of storytelling in advocacy?
So all of this started with that concept of narrative medicine, which is very much focused on storytelling. And not only just the patient's story, but also the practitioner's story, because it's a way for practitioners to recognize that they're also human and that their humanness is going to affect their treatment of patients. Because, for example, doctors grieve patients all the time, and doctors and other healthcare providers need to recognize how they might experience grief and other feelings and emotions, because ultimately it will affect their treatment of patients, because it's impossible to not feel emotion in your job. And I think that it's also not healthy or helpful to block those emotions out, because again, like, we're all human and we're all here trying to help each other in different ways. And so beyond that interest that I had in narrative medicine, which was born out of a lot of research that I did when I was in this master's program, I think that storytelling through writing has just always been a part of my life and has been how I communicate with others. And it's actually interesting that you mention or ask me this question, because I just gave a talk at a local university about my cancer journey, but it was called my life in translation. I've always had a passion for reading and literature and writing. I always say that, especially at a younger age, I really struggled to vocalize my emotions. And I lived in a very challenging household. I just didn't know how to express myself. And I found my voice through writing. And it started out when I was young, writing stories on the back of loose pieces of paper. And they were just little stories about whatever I thought of at the time, oftentimes fictional. And then when I was, I believe, a junior in high school, I took a class that was an AP writing and composition class, and the teacher had us write the personal narrative, and I chose to write about my father's addiction, and I intertwined that with my own sense of self and how I got through tough times. I did a lot of volunteer work and trips to Jamaica. And I somehow combined a trip I did to Jamaica with a story about my dad. And my my teacher offered me paragraphs of feedback because she wanted you to do well. And so I took her feedback and I went back and I rewrote and rewrote, and I loved the feeling of rewriting and writing until I felt like the story represented me and represented the experience. And so that was when I really found out that storytelling could be cathartic. And I found that out for myself, and then continued writing and using that as a means of communication throughout college. My entire degree was pretty much writing. And then when I got my diagnosis, I was writing a lot for myself. But of course, when I learned about narrative medicine and then started to read a lot of patient stories, I realized that this could be something that other patients benefited from. And so that is when I got in contact with my friend and we started brainstorming how we could make this something real.
I think not only have you found an outlet of support for yourself and have given that to others to have a space of catharticism, it's also the narrative medicine piece is so fascinating. And I think the patient voices and patient stories are important to things when it comes to advocacy as well. I mean, be it public policy or clinical trials, there are people working in the oncology space seeking out the stories from patients and the voices of patients. It is a more recognized part of all of the things that go into patient care. The stories are important to making the experience for patients better. So not only are you helping the patients themselves find a cathartic outlet, but you're also contributing to medicine in a way by sharing these stories. And that's an incredibly powerful thing.
No, this is something that we have talked about at some point. I think you were the one who said it, that when you get a cancer diagnosis, you don't have a responsibility to work within the cancer community. Like, you have enough on your plate. But for some people, and this is my case, is that you find a way through your diagnosis through being a part of the community and through giving back to that community. And so I think that for me, it does feel like I have a responsibility, but that's something that's self-imposed. And I believe that it's becoming such an important part of advocacy. I think the more that we speak up and have these voices come out, and that's why it's called Echoes of Us, out of that, the idea of like our voices. And I think that this website is leading to other avenues in terms of not only for me, but for other people. I actually am going back to Spain in a few weeks, and I'm spending all of June there. And I get to go and work with a director there who's in theater, and she's currently writing a piece with pediatric patients at a hospital in Madrid, and they all have neurological diseases. And she wants me to come and watch the work and give her feedback from the patient perspective and to help her change the script and try to give patients in general a voice. And I think that that's so special that she heard about the website and she looked into it and then asked me to do this, because now it's not only benefiting me, it's benefiting her work, which will then.
I have a question for you about Spain. How do you manage the travel with your treatments? I know you travel every chance you get, you go to Spain.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are people out there who are also going through treatment and want to know how you do it. So, how do you manage the travel?
So it's definitely challenging. There have been a lot of times where I haven't been able to do it because of just like my condition. And I struggle with, I had radiation recall and it affected my lungs, specifically my right lung. And so flying for a while was really hard. And I had to be kind of responsible and take a break from especially long flights. But in general, I work with my oncologist to schedule my treatments around my trips and try to figure out a plan. And so for this trip specifically, I talked to him and I explained the importance of having this opportunity with the theater. And then also, this goes back to the idea of having friends who are living their lives and being in a different place. I have friends who are currently living in Spain and teaching English. And when I was about to graduate from college before I got sick, my plan was to go to Spain and study a master's in Spain. And with all my treatment, I wasn't able to do that, but that's one of the reasons why I keep going back when I can, is because it makes me feel like I am taking back some of what got taken away from me. I think that's why my family also understands when I go away for weeks and leave them behind, is because they understand that it is my way of feeling like I'm doing what I wanted to do before the diagnosis. And so back to how I do it, my oncologist and we've had a mutual agreement from the early days of my treatment that for me, what's always going to matter most is quality of life. And so I told him, because right now I'm in an uncertain moment of my treatment. We're not sure if it's necessarily working and what the next steps are going to be, because there just aren't too many treatments out there left for me to try. And so, because it's an uncertain moment, it could feel a little dangerous almost, or like uncomfortable to go travel and not be close by to the hospital and not be trying every other method. But he knows that for me, quality of life means traveling and means spending time with friends. And that is why he's okay with it, and that's why I also feel comfortable with the decision, because I truly believe that I prefer more quality time than time where I'm gonna be sick and in the hospital, even if that means, possibly not getting as much time.
Really
Yeah.
brave to admit, and thank you for sharing that.
It goes back to something you said before earlier in the conversation of life doesn't stop. Life is still happening despite your diagnosis. And I think you had said it more in the terms of the hardships of life still exist even with cancer. But on the flip side of that, life in general still exists. And so, what an important thing to decide with your doctor that you are going to still focus on that despite a diagnosis. I think a lot of people feel that life ends at the moment you're diagnosed with cancer, and that's not necessarily true. And I think you have exemplified that in such a beautiful way.
I think it's important to exemplify that to because, for example, after my diagnosis, my family sometimes talked about me, like, in the room, or, like, I would be in the same room and I would hear conversations about me and my diagnosis, and it would almost sound like I was dead, like, and it was almost like, "Oh, she had such a, like, great life ahead of her," or something along those lines, and I understand that grieving process for families too. But I think that's exactly why it's important to live your life in the way that you want to live your life. I wanted to add about how I travel. I think one part of travel, of course, that's tricky is financial, and like how it's possible to make travel happen when you're paying hospital bills, because everyone tells you to go and live your best life, but that also often costs money. And it's really hard and stressful when you have 1,000 bills and you're not working and you're on disability and like you can't do it all. And so I've been lucky that I've had family and friends who have supported me in some ways, um, whether it be with groceries or just here's some spending money when you go away. But I really want to make a note that a lot of hospitals and a lot of organizations have grants and different options to apply for, and specifically for quality of life, like quality of life grants. And that's something that I've actually gotten on two separate occasions. one through my hospital and one through a separate organization, but they are grants not for medical bills. And you don't feel guilty because they tell you this money is for you to go and do something that makes you happy. And so I just got one that is actually the reason why I'm able to go and do this month with my friends is because I just got a grant that paid for my airfare. And
That's
without that, I wouldn't have been able to do this trip.
Thank you for sharing that because I would consider that a resource for people to know about. I That's so huge, and you're right, there is a l when you have a GoFundMe, it's usually intended to help pay for treatment, the cost of living
Yeah.
while you're covering medical bills, but the fact that this exists, would you tell people who are interested in that to talk to their hospital? Is that where you found this information?
Yeah, if you have a social worker, I would talk to them because my social worker was the one who told me about these grants because I was explaining to her how I really wanted to have this experience and how I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to because of financial, like, just not having the money. And she told me about this grant. And so I would also say that a lot of times, especially through hospitals, they're not necessarily things that are advertised. Like, even your care team might know something about it, but it's not something that is often advertised or talked about, and so that's why I wanted to mention it because it's something that you kind of have to dig a little for.
Sarah, we have a couple questions that we always wrap up with, but wanted to see if you have a message that you want to leave with our listeners.
I would say listen to yourself first, always listen to yourself and to others. And that is a part of storytelling, listening to your own story, listening to the story of others. And that's how we can help each other and understand each other. I think listening is the first step to understanding, and that's how we can make the world a little bit better for all of us.
That's great. If people wanted to further connect with you, which I'm sure after listening to this episode they will want to, where can they find you?
Definitely on my website on echoesofusri.com. I do also have an email, and that email is echoesofusri@gmail.com. I have a personal email, which is sarahdowney02@gmail.com, and then my Instagram, which is sarah.downey20.
Great. And there's an Echoes of SRI Instagram too, right?
Yes. Yeah, thank you for
We'll make
mentioning.
sure all of that is linked so people can check out these stories and hear Sarah's narrative through writing. Sarah's reflections are beautiful. I know I learned so much from them. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. I know that this has been a long time coming. We've been trying to nail down a time to do an episode for a while between your travels and everything you have going on. So I appreciate you making the time to chat with us and our listeners today.
Well, thank you guys.
Thanks for joining us today. Did this episode resonate with you? You can join the discussion about this episode in our Sarcoma Stories Facebook group, linked in the show notes. If you found this podcast helpful, your feedback is incredibly valuable and helps to create more awareness about sarcoma while sharing vital resources with someone who may need it. Be sure to leave a rating and review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.